Hello, good evening. It's 4 o'clock on Friday, and it's time for the Business and Banking Dialogue Show. Welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen. As usual, we are live across the EPS channel and social media, that is Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So, managing the economy in the second wave to achieve 12.5% growth. That's the topic of discussion today in the Business and Banking Dialogue. And to discuss this, this confident-looking message that has come from the World Bank, we have none other than Professor Ananth Narayan, faculty member at the SPJIMR Institute of Management. He is an international banking and financial markets expert. He was previously with Standard Chartered as the bank's regional head of financial markets for ASEAN and South Asia. Right now, you see in front of you a brief profile of Professor Ananth Narayan. You must have seen Professor also in many of the television channels interviewed by CNBC and Economic Times. So it's a privilege to have you here. Ananth has also worked in Deutsche Bank and Citibank. And Citibank is in the news these days for the last couple of days. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Yes, sir, and thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to be with you. And trust all well with you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, the World Bank has scaled up its projection for India's economic growth by a massive 4.7 percentage points to 10.1% for 21-22 due to the strong rebound in private consumption and investment growth. The bank has pegged the GDP growth at 5.4% for the country in its January report for this year, considering the uncertainty caused by COVID cases in 21-22. The bank also gave a wide range of economic growth for India at 7.5% to 12.5%. So they have given a kind of a range, 7.5% to 12.5% for FY22. And I said the bank is the World Bank. So, Professor, what is the basis on which the IMF has raised India's growth forecast for FY22 to 12.5, despite being fully aware that the country is still grappling with a second wave of pandemic and new strains of virus that evade vaccination can cause much disruption?
So once again, thanks for having me, sir, and always a pleasure. To start off, sir, 12.5% growth is not really a great number, even though it looks like a fantastic headline, simply because a lot of it is because of the base effect. Now, let me explain. As you know, in FY20, if let's say the growth was 100, the total GDP was 100, we saw an 8% contraction for FY21, thanks to the lockdown and thanks to the corona situation. So 100 became 92 for the year of FY21. Now FY22, if we ignore FY21 and say from the base of FY20, we grow by 4%. So 100 becomes 104, which is a normal low growth kind of a situation. 104 on a base of 92 the previous year would look like a 13% growth. So in real comparison terms to pre-COVID times, it's merely a 4% growth from the year of FY20, ignoring the year in between. So frankly, it's great growth. I mean, it might sound like a 13% fantastic, we are the number one in the world. That's utter nonsense. In real terms, it's low. Now, you raised another interesting point and a good point, which is, can we even achieve this, given that we are going through a COVID second wave, etc.? Now, look, the clear messages from all governments, central government, state government, local administrations, is we don't really want a lockdown, because the last lockdown cost us a lot of money and cost the economy in terms of jobs, livelihood, output. It cost us a lot. So I think everybody is pretty clear this time around that they don't want to close down the economy. Yes, micro containment zones have been created. Yes, some parts of places where there is a huge problem where hospitals are running full, etc., you have to do something. But even there, it's going to be the bare minimum. So the hope is that we don't go through what we went through last April and May specifically, and that whatever we see is localized, and not really as deep and disruptive as we saw last year. To that extent, I think 12.5%, 13% is okay. It's not a great number, but it's okay. I think more important is how do we go beyond that, and what is the ingredients that we put in place to go beyond that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this report came a little prior to the second wave really pitching this high, and and you see last today and yesterday, lockdowns have started coming up, at least in selective cities, if not the entire country, and that quite a few cities are getting under lockdown. So you still hold that this kind of a growth is still possible, or this projection is possible given the current situation?
So, KK sir, it will be tough, and unfortunately, we don't know how things will pan out. Right now, initially started off as a Maharashtra problem. By the way, Maharashtra is about 15% of the country's GDP. But now slowly we are seeing that this is spreading to other states as well. In fact, we might soon see Maharashtra stabilizing in terms of active cases, but other states, whether it's Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Uttar Pradesh, they're all suddenly, Delhi, they're all suddenly showing a large number of cases. Now, here is the broad math, sir. I think it's very clear that the governments will not want to enforce a full-fledged lockdown. They will do as minimum as possible. They don't want to hurt the economy too much, right? Nevertheless, some amount of contact-based services will have to be clamped down upon. In fact, people will not venture out as well because of the fear, etc. And until vaccination catches pace, you will see some slowdown. So the way the math works, sir, is that if you see 30% of the economy being disrupted for 1 month because of, let's say, COVID during the course of FY22, that would mean something like a 2.5% impact on annualized GDP growth. So what is 2.5% might become 10% because of this. Is that possible? Is it possible that we see a 2.5%, 3% reduction in growth because of the second wave of COVID-19? Unfortunately, sir, it is possible. It is very conceivable that 30% of the economy and across the country is impacted for 1 month period. We'll probably see the peak sometime in middle of May, and then hopefully the cases will come down thereafter. But that can take a toll on the economy. Now, even if that was to happen, I would not lose heart, to be honest, because the reality is that it just pushes out the recovery by maybe a quarter or 2 quarters. Eventually, we will bounce back. We will come back to a 13-14% type growth eventually once this COVID is behind us. But yes, the second wave is something that we didn't expect. I think we started the beginning of the year assuming that we've got seroprevalence and we've got herd immunity. And to that extent, unfortunately, this is a very, very rude shock, and this will have an impact on our economy.
Okay, yeah, let's wait and watch and what else is coming out. So what are the learnings in the last 1 year which is being applied to contain the devastating impact of coronavirus and rebuilding the economy? That will be what will be relevant in the post-COVID world over. We are talking of post-COVID. So we don't know when this COVID is going to end, which is being reset at multiple levels, such as social, economic, supply chain, and technology. What are your thoughts on here? What are the learnings?
It's a very broad question, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Broad brush question. I think one thing that has to be a clear priority for us has to be to get our economy back on the rails. When you talk about social, political, even geopolitical for that matter, clearly we need our country's economy to be in strong condition for us to achieve whatever we want to achieve, either socially or politically or geopolitically. I think one strong takeaway, not just from COVID, but even prior years to COVID. Remember, our economy was not in great shape even prior to COVID. One great takeaway, I think, for us is the need to enhance our domestic output and to create jobs in this country. I think that's a struggle that we've had for 15, 20 years now. And that struggle we've got to use this crisis to come out of and to actually create domestic jobs and output. In fact, I want to quote a very quick statistic, sir. One thing my students keep asking me is, how is it that some indicators show that everything is great? GST collections are going up. Till recently, till before second wave hit us, automobile sales were looking good. Fast-moving consumer goods were reporting good sales and across the rural areas, etc. And against that, you have things like IIP, which is showing negative growth, core sector, which is showing negative growth. A lot of the CMI reports showing unemployment at very high levels. So how do we reconcile the two? I think the way I would reconcile it is the following. We tend to mistake domestic demand with GDP. I think GST is an indicator there is a demand for goods and services. And record levels of 1.2 to 3 lakh crores of monthly collections are indicative of that. There is some demand which has come back, right? Unfortunately, just getting demand doesn't mean GDP goes up. That demand has to be met by domestic output instead of getting the output from imports. If you look at the numbers since November, our imports have gone up sharply, even as our domestic production in IIP, etc., has come down. So what appears to be the case, KK sir, is that our demand is up, not being met by domestic supply. Instead, it's being met by imports. And domestic jobs and domestic output is languishing. This is a cycle we have to break. Almost every economic ill in this country can be traced to the lack or to the slowness in domestic output and domestic jobs. The good news is, I think Atmanirbhar Bharat focuses on the right things, on creating jobs and output in this country. Execution is going to be a huge, huge risk going forward. That's one big jobs and output has to be the mantra. The second big takeaway specifically from COVID, I think the importance of investing in public services, whether it is education, whether it is healthcare, whether it is nutrition, whether it is sanitation, that cannot be. I think that COVID was a sharp reflection on how much we need further to happen on that score. Even now, sir, as we see those really tragic images of people lining in hospitals, unfortunately in crematorium, etc., in some places, and hopefully it will not last for too long. It just tells you that our medical infrastructure, health infrastructure needs a lot more of investments. We've barely spent 1.5% of our GDP on our health infrastructure over so many years now, so many decades. And that paradigm has to change. The shift has to be towards investments into public services, which includes education, healthcare, nutrition, water, sanitation, etc. Some of it is happening, but a lot more needs to happen. So 2 takeaways: jobs and output. Second, public services and infrastructure.
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the things that has really happened is the impact on the healthcare sector. Though, of course, the argument could be that this is never expected. I mean, nobody expected a pandemic of this sort. So that kind of perhaps investments were not going in. But I think going forward, there will be a lot of investments in the health sector. So you talked about job creation being one of the core things. If there has been this thought about massive infrastructure investment, investments into the infrastructure, which can bring about a lot more jobs. Do you think that's a way that needs to be done very, very urgently?
I think so, sir. And by the way, it cannot be just one mantra, because frankly, we don't know what will work. We'll have to try 4 or 5 different mantras. But one basic mantra which is absolutely required is on the line of manufacturing. Now, it's a controversial topic because a lot of us think that we've missed the manufacturing bus. It's too late to catch up now. Plus, there is machine learning, artificial intelligence, robotics, automation happening. How can we create manufacturing jobs? But I think it's an engine we have to try. Right? The reality is, we as a country will increase our demand for manufactured goods and products. Already we see it, sir. We have a large demand for things like plastics, like chemicals, like white goods, your refrigerators, your washing machines. These are growing over a period of time. Automobiles and cars, all these, toys, for instance. All these items are manufactured items. a significant number of them, especially intermediaries, are currently imported. And there is no reason, and we cannot create an ecosystem where some of it is created and made onshore in our country, which is what some of what Atmanirbhar Bharat is trying to do. When you're saying smartphones, let's manufacture here, chemical APIs, pharmaceutical APIs, let's manufacture here, batteries, let's manufacture here. So those things are absolutely in the right direction. It kind of kills two birds with one stone, sir. One is, of course, making sure that we don't import these things, that we manufacture them in-house in the country. And second, creation of jobs. So I think that's a focus area to that extent. Production-linked incentives, the labor law reforms, the tax reforms, they all contribute, but a lot more needs to happen. A lot of execution risks remain as well. As a precursor to investments happening in that from the private sector, clearly public investments have to happen as well. So Mr. Gadkari is doing a lot of investments on roads, for instance.
Yes.
That's absolutely required for building that ecosystem for manufacturing in this country. So manufacturing is one horse that we have to try and make it run. But that doesn't mean we lose sight of the other horses. India is a services-based economy. We've done pretty well on the services side. That has to continue.
Yes.
Essentially, we have to try every single thing we can to create domestic output and jobs. And yes, to that extent, investments are very, very welcome. And the pivot that we saw in this year's budget towards investments into infrastructure and capex, I think, is in the right direction.
Very enough. So, ladies and gentlemen, this being a topic which is, I'm sure, which is of interest to every one of you in the audience, I kind of opening it up now for Q&A so that in time we can take the questions. We will, as you know, wind up at 5 o'clock, and so we would want to stop at 5, so keeping in view the time of our guest. So I look forward to your questions while I continue my discussions with Professor Ananth Narayan. So, sir, what is your take on the efficacy of India's current monetary and fiscal policies to achieve the IMF growth of 12.5 by FY22? So, which is the highest among emerging and advanced countries?
Sure, sir. So first, the caveat, like we discussed earlier, while the headline might look very high, it's because starting with a very, very low base. So as I said, 13% growth over last year is just a 4% growth over the levels seen in FY20. So frankly, it's not something to be very proud of. We have a long, long way to go. The numbers can look disarmingly positive. It's not. There's a long runway ahead. The good news, it can be pushed up. There are lots of things that can be used to push it up. Specifically on monetary policy and fiscal policy, sir. Fiscal policy, we discussed a bit of it. The pivot towards investments as opposed to revenue expenditure. I think it's a step in the right direction. So if you look at the budget for the next for FY22, a couple of quick takeaways. One is the numbers are a lot more believable. The earlier budgets used to hide a lot more than they revealed, and frankly, they were a lot of them were accounting fudges. A lot of those fudges have been removed, so the numbers are a lot more believable. And of the 34 trillion rupees of central expenditure that we saw last year, that number has been kept practically constant, with a dramatic increase in capital expenditure and a reduction in revenue expenditure. Now, of course, a lot depends on the efficacy of the spending. Just because it's capex doesn't automatically mean that things will look great, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. Hopefully, that will do the right things. I would also like to see both center and state pump in a lot more money into public services that we discussed earlier. Education, healthcare, nutrition, sanitation, water. Some of it is happening. So for instance, the healthcare budget has gone up quite dramatically to account for the vaccines for this year. But beyond these one-offs, I'm seeing a lot more needs. It's okay, frankly, if we print money, as long as it's going into these kind of basic investments. I think it will pay for itself over a period of time. On monetary policy, sir, frankly, I think we tend to expect too much from our monetary policy. Here is a quiz question I often ask my students. What is the monetary policy framework of the People's Republic of China? The PBOC, the People's Bank of China. Most economists would struggle to answer that question. For those who are interested, PBOC's actual mandate is to maintain exchange stability of the yuan.
Okay.
It has nothing to do with inflation, etc. Of course, obliquely it has, but not directly. Now, the point being, for an emerging market economy like India, what matters is the real economy. Are you creating what we discussed, domestic output and jobs? If you're creating output and jobs, everything else falls in place. Growth falls in place, inflation falls in place, monetary policy becomes easy, fiscal policy becomes easy, all your problems get solved. Okay?
Yes.
The corollary to that, if you don't have your real economy in good shape, no monetary policy can help you. To expect that you will have a magical monetary policy that will account for the shortfalls of the real economy is being foolish. That cannot happen. Unfortunately, and I really pity the shoes of Governor Das and the folks at RBI. They are in a very, very tough situation. Look at the way things. If you were in their shoes, KK sir, inflation is high and sticky. In fact, it remained high and sticky the whole of last year, despite the slowdown in growth, right? Growth is extremely uneven. We're talking about a K-shaped recovery. Now we have a second wave coming through. It seems to be good in parts. The organized sector is doing well, but we hear of deep distress amongst micro and small medium enterprises. We still have deep distress amongst banks, power, real estate, telecom, airline and shipping, multiple sectors, contact-based services. So it's a very, very divided economy where lots of sectors are not doing well. And on top of it, you have a very, very volatile global context, and you have a huge burden of public debt. You have, going to 90% of GDP. This is an impossible situation for any emerging market central bank. Whatever you do, you'll get beaten up. You cut interest rates, people will say, oh, you're fostering inflation. You keep interest rates high, they will say, oh my God, you're not allowing the fiscal to spend more on. There is nothing you can do. Now, what the governor can do and what RBI and the MPC can do is try and balance and make sure that they don't create too much of chaos, don't create damage. And that is the very, very hard tightrope they're trying to walk. In that context, while I do have my suggestions and problems with some of the steps taken, particularly in respect of currency markets, but overall, I have to admit, I think the RBI has done a fantastic job. It's not an easy landscape at all. So they have tried to keep liquidity ample. They've tried to provide succor to a very, very stressed financial services ecosystem. They've tried to fund the government and make sure that the funding cost for them is not very high. Savers, of course, have a problem, but that's okay. Somebody has to compromise somewhere. So I think given the landscape and given the impossible context they're working in, I think monetary policy is doing a reasonable job, but it is going to be stretched. Given the nature of the context, unless we get jobs and output, monetary policy alone is going to fail in this country.
Okay. So, like I said, ladies and gentlemen, please don't wait for the last minute. Do send in your questions, and I will start taking your questions quickly so that we don't lose out on some questions from you. So do our banks have the forbearance to manage the NPA? There's something that has been dodging us for quite some time now that may pile up to an unprecedented level in the wake of the second wave. Right, become unmanageable or something.
It's looking pretty tough, sir. It's looking pretty tough. Remember that even before the second wave hit us, RBI, the financial stability report suggested under certain scenarios that the total gross NPAs of the banking system might go up to 13.5 to 14.8% of their advances by September of 2021, right? Even if you take the lower end of that number, 13.5%, we are looking at over 14 lakh crores of non-performing assets, right? Now, in addition, there's been about 9 lakh crores of non-performing assets which have been fully provided for 100% and written off the books of banks. Now, it's not a problem for capital for banks. It's already fully provided for. But imagine the load that's going to be there in the bankruptcy courts of this country. Another additional 9 lakhs to this 14 lakh crores of existing loans. Plus, RBI also says Nbfcs, the top 50 or I think the top 500 Nbfcs might have NPAs of between 6.8 and 8.3% of advances. So you add all these numbers, you're looking at something like 26 lakh crores, 27 lakh crores of non-performing assets. either fully written off or existing on the books of banks and NBFCs, which have to be addressed. That is a staggering number. So that's like 13% of GDP. That's an extremely large number. Now, a lot of people correctly say that it's okay. I mean, our system will survive. Of course, it will survive. I mean, that is such a low bar objective to have. To say that my system will survive and therefore I'm happy is nonsense. It's not enough for the system to survive. You want the system to actually fund your growth aspirations, which are very, very large, which means the system and the ecosystem should be able and willing to foster credit growth in this country. We are currently seeing 5.5% credit growth. On 5.5% credit growth, your $5 trillion economy is several years away, right? You need far more, but of course there is also a borrowing problem. Borrowers also need to have ability and willingness and all of that to pay, but even lenders need that, right? So, while the system will survive, that is not enough, and that's not aspirational enough. We need a lot more, and to that extent, work has to happen. Now, what I did here in the budget was two announcements specifically, actually three announcements, which made a lot of sense to me. One was about the bad bank, or the ARC, to take care of it. We're still waiting for the declarations, the actual final fine print on that. I'm hoping that something good comes out of that, because we need a one-time solution to this overhang of NPAs that we talked about. Second thing that was discussed was this DFI, this Development Financial Institution to fund infrastructure. I do think there is, given that people are very, very scared to fund infrastructure projects, with environmental delays, with other land acquisition problems and judicial issues and all of that, you need somebody to take on that risk. And I'm hoping that some new entity can step in to at least guarantee the performance of some of these scores, which are frankly outside of the control of the commercial entities. So that's another good thing to look out for. The third thing was this whole issue of privatization of banks. 2 banks would be privatized, etc. So such changes are required. Frankly, I would be a little more ambitious than what the finance minister suggested. I would say the bad bank has to be a really bad bank, large bad bank, which absorbs a lot of the poison in the system right now, allows the banking system to start afresh, almost like do a Control-Alt-Delete and start afresh. That doesn't look like, we are waiting for the details, but as of now, at least that doesn't seem to be the offing, but we'll wait for the details. But yes, to answer your question, the system currently is in no shape to fund our growth aspirations, but the problems are solvable. The steps announced in the budget on privatization, bad bank, new DFI are all in the right direction. We're waiting for the implementation to happen now. And it's imperative that the implementation done correctly so that our growth aspirations are fulfilled.
We had a good session on the bad bank with Mr. Vijay Kannan, ex-IB chairman. So it looked very good that this comes up, at least a one-time cleanup will happen in the banking area. So we are also hoping that this will get coming soon. Let's hope and see. Wait, we have. Let me take a couple of questions. You talked about MPC, and there's a question coming from YouTube. It says MPC stance was accommodative. It was very much accommodative. That's what they mentioned. Should it have been more aggressive and taken steps to spur the growth of the economy?
It's a great question, and frankly, it's a session by itself, KK sir. So, as I said, let's look at the lay of the land in front of MPC. And I'm giving my personal opinion, or everybody has an opinion on this. I'm giving my personal opinion. But if you were in the MPC, if you were the governor of RBI, what are you looking at? You're looking at sticky and very, very high inflation, particularly core inflation. That's not going away, right? You're looking at credit growth, which is very, very tepid, 5.5%, hardly 5.5% going nowhere, right? Third, you're looking at an extremely large government borrowing program, right? That is the third thing to worry about. Fourth, you're looking at a currency market that has seen a lot of inflows through the course of last year. In fact, RBI has bought close to $150 billion up to March across spot and forward markets. And by the way, monetary policy impacts currency markets direct ways, because there is this question of impossible trinity. So whatever you do on monetary policy will impact all of these, could impact all of these variables. Now, one angle that nobody speaks of is the question of savers. And I stay with my mom. My mom is an 8-year-old pensioner. So, when this announcement was made on 31st of March that the MIS scheme interest rates will come down from 6.6% to 5.7%, she was flabbergasted, right? She financially independent, and when she sees this value, her perceived inflation matches with what the RBI comes out with. So RBI every bi-monthly comes out with inflation survey, which shows that inflation expectations are over 10%, 10.3%, 3 month and 1 year down the road. It matches her expectations. She thinks inflation is 10%. And for her, if you give her a monthly interest of 5.6%, it's just not enough, and she's eating into she's seeing negative real rates, and she doesn't call it that, but that's what she's seeing, right? So, and nobody talks about savers. Everybody talks about industry. Everybody talks about government borrowing. Government can print money. We should hardly bother about their borrowing cost. Just if you're printing so much money, might as well print a little more for savers as well. So the point is, if you repress interest rates too much, you also hurt savers. So these are multiple constituents you have to worry about. And as I said, in the absence of jobs and output, you have to make choices. There is no solution set which can make all these constituents happy about borrowers, the government, savers, inflation, external context. You cannot satisfy all of this together. So RBI has made a choice. RBI has made a choice saying that we will keep interest rates low. I'm guessing it's for 2 or 3 reasons. One is to keep the government borrowing cost low. Second, it's to hope that, if you have mortgage rates at 6.75% for whatever, 10 years, etc., maybe that will spur some kind of investment demand from households, etc. They will see some demand coming through. Maybe that's the calculus. Personally, I would have preferred just the opposite. I would have preferred lower short-term rates and higher longer-end rates. Lower short-term rates, because if you want, at this point in time, you don't want too much of currency inflows. If you push up short-term rates too much, you get even more currency inflows, and there'll be volatile currency inflows, the type of flows you don't want, what we call the carry inflows. So keep short-term rates low so that you actually push out the carry inflows and you don't get currency inflows. Anyway, your credit offtake is only 5.5%. That's not the reason why you have inflation. The traditional idea that hiking interest rates will bring down inflation works when there is high credit offtake, when you have 13, 14, 15% credit offtake. At 5.5% credit offtake, that is not causing you inflation. So anyway, I would have kept low short-term interest rates low. I would have kept long-term interest rates high. Let the government pay 6.5 or 6.75% for 10-year bonds. That's not a problem. They are borrowing so much. If they're borrowing 22 lakh crores across center and states, they can afford to pay this right interest rate, especially when inflation is so high. So, but it's, as I said, as an armchair professor, I can give gyan and say this is what they should do. The person sitting in the hot seat has to make choices. These are not easy choices to make, and you've got to respect that they've done the best under the circumstances.
Absolutely, yeah, I fully agree with you, sir. I mean, it's a tough job, and to balance inflation, balance the growth. It's no easy task. Plus the government, of course. Okay, let's take a direct question to you, if you don't mind. Mr. Shwetab Singh would like to ask you a question. Shwetab, can you unmute and ask the question, please? Shwetab Singh?
Shwetab, you're on mute, yeah?
Shwetab, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, sir. Thanks for this opportunity. Can you hear me now? Okay. So my quick question is that with the whole NPA issue, on the NPA issue, the part of the NPA which are currently defined as a pro forma NPAs in banks, and of course is kind of given the required leeway by central bank. How will that be handled? Because the second wave has come in, and of course people were expecting that with the first wave going away, the vaccines coming in, things will subside, and the new year will see those potential NPAs, I will not call them NPAs, the potential NPAs or statistics going away. How do you see that emanating now with the second wave coming in and in this new year, and how long do you see that lasting, the effect of that lasting in the banking system? Thank you.
Thanks, Shwetab. I wish I could answer your question, but I'll try to the best of my ability. I'll give it two parts, Shwetab. First is, look, I don't think we even know what the true state of NPAs in the banking system and financial services ecosystem is, for a variety of reasons. First, of course, because of the Supreme Court order till March, till the December quarter, the results did not give the right picture on NPAs. And disclosures by individual banks was sketchy in terms of what the real NPAs would have been. So we will get one glimpse as of March end results as and when they come out. Second, even with those numbers, we will not have the full picture because there are some sectors where RBI has provided forbearance to the banks. So you have, for instance, MSMEs, there are some level of forbearances which even predate COVID-19. Likewise, in real estate exposures, some kind of real estate exposures, again, there are forbearances which predate COVID-19. So what we see is not the full number. There will always be a cloud of suspicion about what the real number is. We might have to wait for longer time for that. And the third aspect is NBFCs. While, clearly the RBI scrutiny of the large NBFCs has improved dramatically, the suspicion is, I mentioned the number of 6.8 to 8.3% as per RBI financial stability report. It sounds a little incongruous that our, banks are at 13.5 to 14.8%, but NBFCs are at 6 to 7 or 7 to 8%. It does sound a little incongruous because yes, there are great NBFCs and this is not a reflection on all NBFCs, but as a class, you would expect that NBFCs have more risky assets on their books than banks do, or at least as risky as banks do. So we don't know the real number even pre-second wave. Now, second wave, we don't, again, you're compounding a don't know on top of another don't know now. We don't know what the second wave is going to do, but the chances are that, things like MSMEs, things like contact-based services, your restaurants, your hospitality, your tourism, transport, travel-based services, they'll again be impacted. I think it's fair to assume that the larger companies will probably be okay. In fact, a lot of them have deleveraged since the pre-COVID times, through COVID, and continue to deleverage even now. So the larger ecosystem will be fine. The problem will probably be in specific sectors, such as in real estate, in telecom, in airline and shipping, in power, for instance, where again there is a never-ending problem, and in the large class of MSME and retail loans. How bad can that be, Shweta? I don't know. So my own suspicion, and again, this is an armchair professor suspicion without having too much of information, is that RBI's 13.5 to 14.8% estimate, which people always said, no, it's too high, it won't be that high. I think it's actually quite right. I think it's reasonable. I think actual NPAs, when they fully come out, will be in that ballpark of 13.5, 14.8%. Now, as of now, I would assume and pray that the second wave will not be a debilitating one as far as the economy is concerned. It's obviously a health crisis. It's bad for people, but hopefully we will not see severe lockdowns, and therefore beyond 1 month, hopefully we don't see an impact. If that assumption is right, I think 13.5 to 14.8 will still remain the right ballpark. The good news, Shweta, whatever the number is, it's solvable. We've got a good IBC with some T that can resolve that. And the stuff that we mentioned earlier, a bad bank, a good DFI, some privatization, some capital infusion, a lot of these issues can be resolved. So even if we get a very high number, we should not, give up and say, oh my God, now it's beyond us. Nothing is beyond us. We can still solve it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Shweta. Very good question. But everything is hinging on how the COVID is going to play, and on that there is absolutely, we don't know what's going to happen. Let's take a question also from Pushpendra Khandelwal. He says, "Sir, one side demand is increasing, but the same is satisfied perhaps with imports and not by production, and that is local production. And RBI expects a GDP growth by 10.5%, and I think the World Bank is selling at 12.5%. But the recent wave of COVID has increased the tension, and also the problem of migration of laborers is increasing. How can we expect the expected level of growth of GDP?"
A great question, Pushpendra, and thanks for that. So let me try and again break it up into two parts. Look, there will be uncertainty around growth in the short term, simply because we don't know, as KK sir said, we don't know what's going to happen on COVID. We are hoping that it'll subside, hopefully as quickly as it rose, it'll subside maybe by mid-May and end May. And then we stagger back and vaccinations will pick up and then things will become fine. So that's what we hope and pray for. But I would pay a lot more attention beyond the short term to what happens to life post-COVID. I know it sounds very, almost obscene to think about post-COVID when we are struggling through COVID second wave. But I'm saying The real test for our economy and for us as a country would be post-COVID. How do we manage growth, and what is our steady state growth? Now, a lot of economists are worried that what used to be 7%, assume that you will be a 7%, will now come down to 5%. Our potential growth is coming down quite dramatically. I think this is where our thrust has to be. Post-COVID, of course, COVID you have to handle. You have to vaccinate, you have to provide relief. Maybe you have to provide another MSME round of relief as we did during the first round, etc. So all that has to happen. But beyond that, I think the focus has to be on jobs and output. And the question you asked is absolutely spot on. Getting, lot of people say, oh, we need demand in this country. Give money in the hands of people, demand will follow. Let's take the parallel of 2009, 2013. Okay, post the global financial crisis, we saw a fiscal spending which went through the roof. Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister at that time. He let the fiscal deficit blow up, right? Similarly, at that point of time, if you remember, credit offtake was 25 to 30% from banks. So there was a lot of money being pumped into the system, both fiscal front as well as credit front. Plus, we also saw some FX inflows before that in 2008, etc. So money was being created. Demand was there. That was the time when Narega started. 2009, 2010 is when Narega started. Money went in the hands of people. Demand did go up. Consumption went up. Investment supposedly went up because credit growth was happening. Government spending went up. Yet GDP did not grow. Because you know what? We were not creating exactly what you said. We were not creating domestic output. Instead, our imports went up dramatically. Our current account deficit went through the roof, and inflation followed. Okay, so we were demanding goods like proteins where there's not enough supply. So protein inflation, food inflation went through the roof. Dr. Subir Gokarn, the late Dr. Subir Gokarn, used to keep speaking about it. And on the other hand, you also had a lot of demand for electronics, for chemicals, for fertilizers, for toys, for plastics, all of which were imported. And therefore, your import bill went up dramatically. So net, it boils down to how do you create jobs and output in this country. Now, if we can do that, if we can raise our domestic output, I think all our problems can be solved. Whether it is inflation, whether it is growth, whether it is inequity, whether it is investments into education and the fiscal side, education, healthcare, public services. And this is where I think the Atmanirbhar Bharat, I mentioned that earlier, becomes so critical. Now, to be fair, there are some things which are happening, right? So we've seen labor reforms. We've seen taxation reforms in 2019, September, when tax rates were cut down to 22%. We've seen this PLI. PLI looks like a very, very big scheme to try and bring in supply chains from China. A lot of global companies are looking at China plus one strategy. So they're thinking of bringing in other places. So now it's a great start, but the execution risks here are dramatically large. The fear I have is that we will declare victory very easily and very quickly without actually achieving what we need to be achieving, right? So I'm practically personally waiting with bated breath and hoping that this focus that we've got on continued reforms, continued privatization, continued things like PLI to bring in supply chains into India, continued investments into infrastructure like roads and ports, etc. This all comes together to create domestic output and increase domestic jobs. It will not happen overnight. This will take time. And there are lots of other stumbling blocks. Sir mentioned, land acquisition, courts taking too much time, contract enforcement. These are all stumbling blocks, but they can be resolved over a period of time. They can be addressed. If that happens and we create domestic output and jobs, our potential growth can go back to 8-9%. I am no person who I'm typically a cynic, but even a cynic like me will tell you 8-9% growth is within reach as long as we can create that cycle of domestic jobs and output. I mentioned China earlier, monetary policy framework. Look, China fudges their accounts 10 times more than we do, whether it is fiscal accounts, whether it is monetary accounts, whether it is a corporate accounts, everything, right? Yet one thing you cannot deny, they have created jobs and output. They are the manufacturing capital of the world. So once you've done that, once you've created the real economy, jobs and output, you can do whatever you want on the monetary side. You can do whatever you want on the fiscal side. You can even do anything on the geopolitical side as they're doing right now. So that is our bottom line. Jobs and output is our bottom line over 3 years, and we have time. We have enough ample FX reserves. We have other contingencies and buffers available. So we have time. In the next 3 years, if we can start to create this virtuous cycle of jobs and output, I think that is our least common denominator road to success.
Super. I think very well explained, Professor. Excellent. Really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you, Pushpinder. Very good question. Uh, let me get to another sector. Harish, can you just hang on for 2-3 minutes, please? Let me open up another sector. We looked at NPA. Now look at the uh, monetizing of public assets. Okay, sir, do you agree that the government plan to monetize public assets to raise capital to boost infrastructure development, which may spur economic growth and generate employment? Is that public asset monetization has been our topic for pretty long, and you think the time has come for us to execute that?
This is an extremely controversial topic, KK sir.
Yeah.
So
Doesn't matter, sir.
Whatever I say, but I'll give you my honest opinion view.
Yeah.
It's obviously a biased view. I think what the Prime Minister mentioned, that government has no business being in business.
Yes.
The first time any Indian Prime Minister ever said this in the floor of the Parliament.
Yes, absolutely.
I agree with that. There are lots of things this government is doing which I don't agree with, but this one I personally agree with. If you look at the market capitalization of public sector enterprises in this country, I think it's about 18 lakh crores on the BSE, PSU market cap, etc. It's remained like that for the last 10 years. It has really not changed over the last 8-10 years. Okay? So now you can argue that market cap is not necessarily the best barometer of all the output the PSU is doing, but the point is a lot more efficient use of capital can happen in the private sector. Okay? To that extent, I think the government getting out of the private sector is good news, right? And especially if that gives the government some leeway and some funding to be able to invest into very, very critical areas now. We talked about them, sir: education, healthcare, sanitation, public services, urban infrastructure, and of course things like roads, ports, etc., where there's no investments happening at this point in time. I think if it allows for that investments to happen, I think it's a fantastic idea, right? There are some caveats though. There are some real caveats on here. One is, I think, while you move towards privatization, you have to be conscious that this is a political hot potato, right? Now, it's also coming at a time when the divergence between the haves and the have-nots has expanded dramatically. I think the most obscene representation of that we saw was last year, and through the course of last year, when stock markets are now at close to all-time highs, when you know the economy has gone through severe distress, you know that divisions have gone up. So you have to be sensitive to these things. The second thing you have to be very, very sensitive to is you don't want even allegations of crony capitalism to come in, because that can completely vitiate the atmosphere, right? It is one thing to say, I will give it to the private sector, let the private sector do their job, and I will police you, and I will make sure that you have a level playing field, no cartelization or monopoly and stuff like that. All those things you will take care of. You don't want to be faced with flack that you're being pro-rich and you're creating cartels and you're being pro-crony capitalism. So it's a fine tightrope that the government has to walk. And it has to not only do the right thing, it has to be seen as doing the right thing. Otherwise, this can be a very, the execution can become a real problem if you don't manage this the right way. But in a sense, I think this privatization is good. It will allow the government to spend money on public services and new public utilities, which requires a lot of investments. It will allow the investments into infrastructure, etc. And of course, focus the attention of the governments on public services rather than running businesses, which they're doing inefficiently anyway right now.
Yeah, I think it's a good move. Let's see. Today was the announcement of which of the banks we are going to be privatized. Till 3 o'clock, I did not see any news on that. Today the committee was to meet.
I haven't seen either, sir. So no.
Okay, all right. Okay. So look forward to that. Okay, let me take a direct question now from Harish Prabhu. Harish, please unmute and ask the question.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mr. Narayan. Yeah, in fact, I have a very, very sort of a simple benchmark that this government intention has been sort of made very clear. And those sort of few silver bullets, one is unthinkable Air India privatization, right? I mean, this was something which had to be done 25 years ago, but anyway, IDBI into PSU banks, and Atmanirbhar Bharat and the infrastructure focus, right? So technically speaking, if you really analyze each and every action, and then, the regular, what do you call, operating decisions of monetary policy, blah, 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 and all, right? I think that, the government seems to have sort of sorted its act out. Are there any other these kind of actions which I'm missing, or even more? Because I'm not a economist. So can you throw light on more such, silver bullets that can really, show hope to us that we are on a secular sort of growth path, for a great economy?
So Harish, thanks for the question. I'm going to do my favorite role of being an armchair professor and asking for the moon, because I have the privilege of doing that. But let me tell you what are the areas I'm watching personally, and then comment on how the government is reacting in each of these areas. To me, there are 3 or 4 things which are of critical focus areas which the government needs to do a lot of work on. Okay, and we have discussed in parts all of them, but I'm going to put them all together out here. The first is the health of the financial services ecosystem. Okay, I would start with that. Very, and as I mentioned earlier, very critical to fund our aspirations, growth aspirations. This ecosystem should be able and willing to fund our growth aspirations. At the moment, it's not. Okay, so to me, cleansing of the financial ecosystem, whether it is a bad bank, whether it is bank privatization, whether it is a new DFI, whether it is other things to try and capitalize the banks and make them in a position to run. All this becomes super important and critical. Okay, I would add Nbfcs also to the bank. So that is one big chunk where work has to happen. Some work has been promised. I'm waiting for the fine print. Okay. Second one would be related to the first one. There are several sectors of the economy which are under chronic stresses. Okay, and that's how they ended up as NPAs in the banking books. This includes real estate, power, telecom, airline shipping, MSMEs, you name it. There are, from contact services now, I guess, transport. So multiple such areas which are under stress, some of which require regulatory cleansing. Telecom requires regulatory cleansing. Power sector, God knows, requires a regulatory cleansing. There has to be some authority coming in and cleaning up that mess out there. Real estate, likewise, requires some amount of cleansing. A growing economy alone will not resolve these issues. These require policy changes as well to happen. So that's a second chunk of silver bullets or areas of focus, as I would call it. The third is the big one that we've talked about several times today, which is jobs and output, which is create an environment where investments become easier. Investment-friendly environment where output can be created, jobs can be created. To be fair, here a lot of good work has happened, right? So labor law transformation, tax rates being cut, PLI schemes being announced, a whole host of things being done to try and foster, get the supply chains into the country, etc. Work is happening out there, but it's a continuous process. Just changing 3 laws and announcing 3 schemes will not make you China. China became China over 30 years with a lot of hard work, right? So we still need to sort out our land acquisition issues. We still need to sort out our courts. We still need to sort out our contract enforcement, policy certainty, lots of other issues besides being absolutely dogged in getting the large guys to come and manufacture in this country and create a manufacturing ecosystem in this country. So that's a third thing. The fourth thing, very critical, where I don't see enough happening, and this is not just central, it's also, and particularly this is states, investments into public services, education, healthcare, nutrition, water, sanitation. This is, if you ask me, this is the most critical of all the 4, particularly from a long-term perspective. Because reality, Harish, is that we don't know what the secret to success 10 years down the road is. Yeah, China managed manufacturing and jobs. We don't know how life is going to be 15, 20 years from now. What we know is one thing. If we feed our children, if we give them good education, if we give them the resources, they will take care of our future for us. We have to empower them and give them the wherewithal to create their own future. They will take care of us. At the moment, we are not doing that. Look at the stunting statistics for Indian children, 0 to 5 years, 30-35% stunting, 30-35% wasting statistics. I have people who are involved in NGOs and education, etc. They tell you that if a child has not received enough, is malnutritioned until the age of 5, no amount of education thereafter will make that child fit for a CA or an IIT or an IIM or whatever. It will be a very, very rare child which manages to do it. So there's a lot of work to be done. Every time we've given a speech to our foreigners, we've said our biggest prize is our dividend, the demographic dividend.
Yeah.
And if we don't invest in this area, frankly, we are going to lose our demographic dividend. So these 4 areas, good work happening in all of them, to be honest, but a lot, ye dil mange more yaar, aur bahut kuch karna hai.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Harish. Thanks, sir. Very good answers. Yeah, I think there are many silver bullets, but it's time to fire, I guess. It's the high time we start firing those bullets to reap the dividends. We looked at it. We have looked at monetizing. What are the stimulus to growth sectors to jumpstart the economy? What is being done to create industry clusters which may act as a launch pad for the economy? Is that a good thing to do, to create industry clusters?
I think so, sir. I think so. Again, I'm not an expert in these areas, but friends that I've spoken to, for instance, Ajit Ranade, I've heard of Aditya Birla Group explaining how in China, you have these large provinces which are a one-stop shop for, let's say, textile manufacturing. Now, we are also pretty good at textile manufacturing, ready-made garments, but China has overtaken us in a big way, and now other countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam are doing the same. But the difference he says that China has managed is that they have this one large province which, as he calls it, is zip to Zara. So which that province produces yarn, it produces fiber, it produces buttons, it produces zip, and it has the designers and the people who put them all together to create fantastic output, right? And then you have that particular province connected to the rest of the world through deep sea ports and a whole supply chain, etc. And therefore, you're able to deliver very high quality products at low cost to the rest of the world. Now, in India, as a parallel, yes, we do have our export zones. We do have a Tirupur, we do have a Ludhiana, we do have a Surat and all that. But the scale is very, very different. We have very, very small enterprises in general, which are engaged in this. Creating an ecosystem of larger players, enticing people to become larger and create smaller supply chain manufacturers, etc., within a closed geography, and having them, for instance, having a connectivity to from the hinterland to the ports and ability to send out, I think would make a lot of sense. It will be a bet, sir. The reality is, this formula worked for China 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Will it work for us? We don't know, but I think it's worth a shot. And I'm willing to bet that this strategy still has steam even for the next 10, 15 years. By the way, the budget has money set aside for textile parks, which I think is a part of the same thing, to try and get manufacturing in one place.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So let me. So the other point is on the. We come back to the World Bank saying the general government deficit is expected to remain about 10%. Is what they said, 10% of GDP until FY22. As a result, public debt is projected to peak at almost 90% of the GDP in FY21. Is that a cause of worry for us?
Now, this is one of those areas, KK sir, that is at the cusp of new thinking in economics. Thank you, I'm not an economist, but economics is at crossroads. There are many people who say, why are you even bothered about things like fiscal deficits? And there are others who are the old school who say, you forget things like fiscal deficit at your own peril and watch how things blow up. I'll give you my own take on this. I think it's a cause of worry. Yes, larger countries like the US, Japan, ECB are going berserk right now and printing their money, doing a lot of things. We are not US, Japan, or Europe. When we print, look, the biggest problem to printing too much of money, and by the way, fiscal deficits which are funded by banks and RBI does create money. It's actually putting money in people's hands. The biggest risk of that is inflation, right? Inflation and eventually currency debasement if you're only importing rather than producing. The one way out of this is what the mantra that I mentioned earlier, which is output and jobs, domestic output, domestic jobs. If you get that, you can pay for this 90% of GDP. If we falter in the execution of Atmanirbhar Bharat, and if we go down in some form of the path of 2009, 2013, where we don't produce enough of domestic output, domestic jobs, eventually all this public debt will cost us heavily in terms of inflation, in terms of currency replacement.
Okay. All right. We come to the last. This one question, this thing on the geopolitical side. Shwetab says that this is amazing session with real insightful views coming up. Thank you, Shwetab. He asked a quick question to you, sir, whether the geopolitical changes between, that is, the trade relations between India and the geopolitical relation between India and China, has that costed us, has that been a setback for us?
Great question, Shwetab. Look, I guess there's nothing much that we could have done in the circumstances. I mean, I don't think we went looking for trouble with China, but that apart, I think there is an element of opportunity as well for us in this new global geopolitical outlook. Look, clearly the dominant theme globally right now is US-China. And by the way, Taiwan could be a flashpoint over the next few years. We don't know how things are looking like. There are lots of geopolitical experts who suggest that with all the semiconductor prowess that Taiwan has got, along with Korea, Samsung, it is a prize that is worth a war, right? And plus, China is playing the wolf warrior theme right now. It has the economic heft, it has the military heft, and it is definitely flexing its muscles at multiple locations, right? With Japan, with Taiwan, with Hong Kong, with South China Sea, with India, with Australia. It's really flexing its muscles. So the US-China pivot, I think, will be a defining kind of a theme in geopolitics. And clearly the switch from Trump to Biden has not changed that. A lot of people thought it was a Trump thing. It's not a Trump thing. It's a US bipartisan thing, right? And it is a China bipartisan thing. Now, what that means is that things like the Quad with India, Japan, US, and Australia gain in prominence. Okay, two things I see coming as a result of this. One is a lot of countries in the globe are definitely looking at a China plus one strategy. I think the world has come to recognize that there is too much of dependence on China, and that they need to shift their supply chains from this massive concentration in this one location. India has a chance there. You can argue that we have started slow. We have started slow, but we do have a chance there, especially with our large burgeoning domestic population. I think that we have a large chance there. The second is beyond the economics in a geopolitical strategic sense. Over the last 20 years, 22 years, 23 years, ever since the nuclear test of 1998, after that nadir that we saw in the relationship with US, I think we've seen a steady improvement in Indo-US relations. We might not always like each other. We might not always, as they say, you don't have permanent friends, but you have permanent interests. At this point in time, the interests of the US and India are increasingly coinciding, right? Which means there could be a strategic, without becoming something like a NATO in Asia, we could become a lot more closer to the US, both militarily as well as economically. Now, a lot of people would suggest that's not a great thing. Personally, I think it's not a bad thing. I think it's good to benefit from some of the pushback on China, both militarily as well as economically. So yes, the world is changing. The nature of the economies are changing. It's no longer the brick and mortar stuff. It's all e-commerce. It's all cryptocurrency. It's all automation, robotics, and what have you. Who the hell knows what the economy will look like in 10 years from now?
Yeah.
And geopolitics is changing as well. I think a re-emergence of a bipolar world might not be a bad thing for India.
Thank you, Professor. I think we've run out of time, and as usual, it's been so interesting. The hour just flies off whenever you're there. There's so much to talk, and there is so much still to talk. Okay, but we have a time barrier. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to conclude today's session. Like Mr. Timmer said, the chief economist of the World Bank, South Asia, he said, so a big bounce back in India is there, but India is not completely out of the woods yet. So that's also something to look at. We are going to unprecedented times. There's no doubt about it. What the future holds is completely unknown. Let's hope for the best and draw confidence from World Bank estimates and from what Professor said, that it is possible. There is a lot of hope. Despite all the problems that we have, there is a lot of hope. In these words, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor for his wonderful insight into this talk on 12.5% growth economy. Professor, once again, thank you very much for coming over and discussing with us.
Thank you so much, KK sir, and thank you to EPS for calling me. Really appreciate this. All the very best, and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, before you leave, please note the coming week we have Mr. Yashish Dahiya, co-founder and CEO of Policy Bazaar. A thought luminary joins us on April 21st at 4 p.m. in our business and banking dialogue. The topic is expanding the scope of financials. So let's hear from Mr. Yashish Dahiya next week, and hope to catch up with all of you on April 21st. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.